So this session will consider a variety of activities under the broad heading of capability development. But rather than looking at specific implementation mechanics, it will instead consider the higher level rationales, guiding approaches, and frameworks that underpin capability development in science advice. So the aim of this session is to show concrete examples, very diverse one, of the elements that make up the foundation for how we raise capacity and evolve the field, as well as showcasing each element. The session will give us the opportunity to discuss how this intersect and where gaps might exist. The main framing of this session is to consider the types of tools and frameworks that are advancing capabilities development in different programs, regions, and models that will be presented. It's also worth to say that this is sort of designed in such a way that it's a tester of some of the different ways we're all approaching the work of science advice, science diplomacy, from formalized training programs at the pre-professional level through to frameworks that can help us situate and develop the actions needed to develop health ecosystems, and on to a couple of specific novel approaches that are showing some of the promise. So we have gathered an excellent group of panelists to talk to us about this, and we have 5 of them, but I will start inviting them one at a time to the stage, and they will, when I call their name, and I'll introduce them, and they make an introductory remark, and at the end we'll have a discussion and an interactive session. So I'm going to start with an invitation to Dr. Shaheen Mutala. Can you please join us? Welcome, Shaheen. Just to say a few words about Shaheen, she was heading the Regulatory and Accreditation Division of the Higher Education Commission of Mauritius since 2020. She joined Middlesay University in Mauritius, the branch campus of the one in UK in 2024 as the head of Academy and Quality Enhancement. She is a member of the Steering Committee of African Chapter of INGSA. In fact, as of yesterday, the incoming chair of INGSA Africa. So, welcome, Shaheen. So, you have 4 to 5 minutes to give us an introductory remark on the Science Advanced Skills Development Program that INGSA Africa has been running for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, Binyam, for your kind words. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm a member of the INGSA Africa Steering Committee. I joined in 2021, and INGSA Africa has been undertaking a lot of capacity building project activities across Africa, and one of these programs is the Science Advice Skills Development Program, which we started in 2022. Sameh had this idea, and we carried it forward. So what is Science Advice Skills Development Program? So this is a mentoring program, which is very human-centered, I would say, where we join mentees to mentors. So our mentees are early career, mid-career scientists from the African continent, working in different areas, but the main theme that we chose for this program was climate change. So any research that you are doing in climate change, whether it's hard sciences or social sciences, so you could apply as a mentor for this program. And so we started the program in 2022, and it was run over a period of 3 months. So it was a virtual program, and the mentors came from Africa and from and beyond Africa, from very different countries. We had a cohort of 10 pairs of mentor-mentees, and it was run for 3 months. And after that, we had a closing workshop where we talk to the mentees and the mentors, and we tried to improve the program. So for this program, it was a learning experience, I would say, for both the mentees, mentors, and for ourselves as INGSA Africa. The aim is to provide skills, capacity building in science advice for mentees in Africa, but also to connect mentors to people who are doing science research in Africa and to enlarge the network of those who are interested in doing science for Africa and in providing science advice to government. So the next cohort we had was in 2023. This time it was run, I think it was over 6 months, so we increased the duration of the program. That was one of the feedback that we had from the mentees. And we are now on the 3rd cohort. So up till now, we have trained 22 mentees, and we're still learning. We're still trying to improve our program. And so we have 22 mentees trained in science advice, and we are launching the next goal for this program. So we have had meetings with mentees, and we understand that there are quite a few challenges that scientists faced in African continent, and I think that it is across the different continents. How to talk to the decision makers, how to transform your findings, your research findings into evidence, and how to get to communicate that to decision makers, to policy makers. So these are a few things that we try to address through this program, and we try to go beyond that. Of course, one of the things that we realize is that our mentors are volunteers. So they are giving their time for this program, and this is one of the strengths of this program. It is the commitment of the people, whether they are mentees, whether they are mentors, or whether they are the people from INGSA Africa. So basically, this is about the Science Advice Skills Development Program, the SESDP. This is how we call it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaheen. Please join me in giving her your hands. Thank you, Shaheen. I think the results of that program is obvious in a way that, I don't know, many of those fellows are also filling up this room. So thank you for sharing that experience. I now want to move quickly to my another colleague and friend, Alma Cristal Hernandez Mondragon. Welcome, Alma. So Alma is a visiting researcher at the Center for Research and Advanced Studies of the National Polytechnic Institute in Mexico, where she develops research on science policy interface. She is a member of the steering committee of INGSA, Latin America and Caribbean region. She is a member of the Global Young Academy, and she is a founding member of the Mexican Association for the Advancement of Sciences. And she will be talking to us about development of introductory science advice curriculum and her efforts to establish a pioneering training program on science policy interface in Mexico. Alma, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Binjam, and thanks all of you for your interest in this panel. I know that there is a very fierce competition, and thank you for staying here. Well, if I may, I want to start with a question, a very quick question, only for 1 point. I promise I have a point. Please, can you raise your hands, all the people who are actually in their master or PhD studies? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And how many of you receive a training in science advice as part of your curricula? Okay, thank you. Well, the slogan of this conference in INGSA is the transformation imperative, right? And this transformation cannot happen without next generation of scientists. And this, I think that this reminds us that we live in an evolution process. As a chemist, I reflect on how before the 17th century, chemistry was not a field in the current form that we know now. It was alchemy, and they were looking for a kind of philosophical stone and things like this. But it was until Robert Boyle, in the Skeptical Chemist, began to develop the principles of modern chemistry. And this process of evolution allowed us to have now, today, a career for chemistry, places for chemistry, specializations in chemistry. What about science advice? We need two things, I think, that are very, very important: institutionalization and professionalization. We need schools, we need courses, we need to fight with a lot of things, but we are really in a very good moment of the history of the science advice. You know, the pioneering work of our esteemed colleagues like Peter Gluckman, like Jan-Marco Müller, like Roger Pearce Jr., and so many other colleagues who around the world who were us where we are now. But what comes next? How can we further institutionalize and professionalize the science advice for the new generation? Especially in countries like in the Global South, like in the Latin American region. I work in Mexico. In Mexico, especially, and in the INGSA Latin American chapter, we just realized that this thing, we need to involve next generation. And we asked why we need to wait until the people are already trained as a scientist. Why we can start before? And with how? Well, we develop a course and a very specific introductory elective topic on science advice, because just as Shaheen mentioned, you need people with a lot of willingness to and people who want to give us their time, their interest, their commitment. So harnessing generational change involves prepare science students, the next generation of students, to be ready to lead the future of science advice. And we need, in order to do that, we need to ensure that that they understand that all the career options that are available, because aspiring to a career that we don't even know that exists is difficult. And so one of our biggest challenges is overcoming the reluctance of some colleagues to recognize the importance of science advice, and it's just and its impact on evidence-informed policymaking. So if we can prepare next generation of scientists, maybe if we start today, we can avoid having to start from the scratch every few years, every 5 or every 2 years. We don't need to start from scratch. So if we provide them with support, maybe we we will contribute to a more inclusive and collaborative academia. And I will share with you some other details in a few moments. Thank you, Vinya.
Thank you very much, Alma. You know, I'm not a chemist, but what was the name of the chemist that contributed? Boyle. Okay. Robert Boyle. Maybe you are our Robert Boyle for science advice. Who knows? Because it just requires people who knows how things are done historically, and then also know the commitment and the imagination to do it. So who knows? We'll see in a few years. So let me also move quickly now to our third panelist, Natalia Sokolovska. Please come to the stage. Natalia heads the Knowledge and Society Research Program at the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin. She works at the interface between science, politics, and society, and is interested in ways on how to increase societal relevance of research and develop convenient quality assurance mechanisms in science policy advice. In 2021, she was an advisor in the Crisis Science Project of the German Ministry of Education and Research. Natalia, welcome, and your 5 minutes introduction.
Thank you very much.
It has to be on.
Now, okay. Thank you very much, Binyam, for your kind words. Thanks, everyone, for joining our session. Yes, indeed, I've been working for quite a while in science communication and doing research on science policy advice, a lot from an academic perspective, but also developing practical formats for communication and for co-creation. And today I would particularly like to focus on quality assurance and to think about like what is good expertise, what is good evidence, and what makes it actually trustworthy. Because indeed, academic knowledge is considered, it's even called sometimes the superior kind of knowledge. So it's considered to be quite reliable. And often because in many countries it enjoys a high level of independence and a high level of autonomy, so which leads to good possibility to have also transparent quality assurance mechanisms and to produce reliable insights. Not everywhere, not always, of course, but still it is one source of many sources for knowledge and for advice. And I think it would be good and better to just not speak only about the science and the source of academic knowledge, but also look more into what stage of inquiry is this coming from. Is it a finished study, or is it an ongoing study and with someone voicing a preliminary opinion? I think it would be good to have to get more information and see at a glance kind of what is the method behind, what kind of data, evidence, what is part of a policy document or part of any output. And this sounds, in my opinion, this sounds like a lot of work and a lot of knowledge. I do not think that this could be left only to researchers. And I think that this is something that has to happen on the science policy interface, and that all actors that are part of the science policy interface and the interaction would actually would profit from a better understanding of quality mechanisms. And in this respect, I brought 2 thoughts that I'd like to share with you and that I'd like to discuss. And the first one is, the thoughts are on what can help supporting quality assurance and what can help to serve for more quality. The first is digital infrastructures. So Germany is currently launching a central nationwide repository for policy advice documents. It's called Repod. And the idea is to create a central point of access to expertise. And why can it be interesting in terms of quality? Because, for example, it can help policymakers or whoever is interested in the advice. We don't speak only about policymakers. There are also civil society actors or journalists who are interested in using this expertise for their activity. So this can help to find and compare multiple perspectives. So for example, counter-instrumentalization. Because often instrumentalization happens, not always, but often, unconsciously, unless you are a hardcore populist who looks really for expertise to confirm what you wanted to say. It often happens because policymakers or public officials are used to work in their networks, and they kind of recurrently work in their networks, and such a point of access would be one more chance to bring like, new voices and new expertise into the discussion. Also, it can serve for transparency if we have good metadata and we can give more information on uncertainties, on the methods used, on the data expertise, evidence, or the underlying expertise. This could help, and like knowing more what feeds into these policy documents, which brings me to my second thought. That is, what is a policy document? More or less every institution can define it by themselves, and there are a lot of institutions, there are a lot of academic institutions, there are a lot of non-academic research institutes that engage in policy advice in Germany, more than 1,000. And I think we could profit from a common language on the science policy interface. So to know what is a policy document, to have types of these documents, this would make the search easier. Am I looking for a one-pager with recommendations for the normative part? Or am I looking to get some in-depth insights, state-of-the-art knowledge of what is actually there on expertise, a meta-study? I guess that would also, it would provide for more efficiency, but also more transparency. And then my third and final thought, I don't know how, whether it's fine for the time, but it will be a very short one. So taking up a bit on the debate around skills, so not only for like understanding of quality assurance and skills in understanding and mediating in this quality debate, I think that the science policy interface and researchers would profit from having mechanisms to protect researchers from hostility. And during the pandemic, we have seen that researchers going public with their work can become targets of massive discreditation attacks, of hate speech, of trolling, even get death threats, get physically attacked, and this is actually quite dangerous because it can lead to silencing, it can lead to self-censorship among research. I mean, it's understandable. If you go public and you only get attacked and you only get hate, then why should you go public? So in one of our studies, we've seen that some researchers actually they left social media, or they did not want to engage in media relations or something. And there are skills, communication skills that can actually help prevent this, help counter it, and there are support structures or like models for support structures. There are first help desks that are appearing, like to teach these skills and to help in critical situations. So I think this is another thing that would help provide for more perspectives and help provide more quality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I think the question of, I'm a linguist, maybe just because I heard the common language, and yesterday there was a talk of science as a common language, but I think there is something that needs sort of to be unpacked in the sense that, you know, how and then it could be related to the quality assurance that we have talked about, but we will follow it up later. And now I wanted to invite our fourth panelist, who is Ian Wiggis. Ian, yeah. Please join me in welcoming Ian. Ian is the Director of International Affairs for the Royal Society, where he leads the Society's global engagement. Before joining the Royal Society, he has worked at the University of York. And I guess before that, or in between, he He was a British diplomat, including postings in Moscow and Washington, D.C. Ian, welcome, and you have your 4 to 5 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to start a timer, because otherwise I will go for much longer than 4 to 5 minutes. So I've been asked to say a little bit about the frameworks bit of the topic that we're talking about, and it leads quite nicely on to what you've just been saying about how we kind of define subjects, how we look at them. And so to start that, I want to ask a question, a slightly rhetoric question, and that's, am I a science diplomat? And so to give you a little bit of kind of information to help answer that, I'm a chemist by training, so another fan of Robert Boyle, but then I spent the first part of my career working for the British government as a diplomat. A number of roles, some of those science related. I worked on climate change for a bit. I once lobbied the Russian government about whether we should have a leap second or not. And to my shame, I cannot remember on what the UK government position was, whether we were for or against it. But then I left the diplomatic world and I worked in a university for a while, and now I'm the international director for the National Academy. And so to answer that question, kind of, am I a science diplomat, you might use a framework to approach that question if you're thinking in a kind of analytical sense. And in that sense, frameworks can be really important tools for us to help define concepts, in this case science diplomacy. They're helpful to give us a sense of an area to study, to put some kind of boundaries around that, to help us build campaigns if we want more of something or less of something, to study something's effectiveness. You've got to define it first to know whether it works or not. And as we're talking about today, if you want to build capability in an area, you've got to kind of know what that area looks like. But the thing about frameworks is that they definitely need to be refreshed over time. They do not stay forever true. What Robert Boyle might have talked about as science advice hundreds of years ago is definitely not what we talk about science advice now. In 2010, the Royal Society with colleagues at AAAS in the States published New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, which some of you might be familiar with. It's arguably coined some of the definitional terms that we talk about around science diplomacy, about science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. And a good number of the contributors to that report are here in Kigali as well. And there's a lot in that 2010 work which is absolutely still valid today, a really helpful framework that helps us kind of talk about, analyse, build capability in the frame of science diplomacy. But the world's also moved on a lot in 15 years. And so with colleagues in AAAS, to mark that 15-year anniversary, we're going to be revisiting that report based on feedback from a whole load of engagements, like the conversations we've been having with many of you over the last couple of days. And we'll publish an update at some point about what we think has changed, what that framework might look like today. And so a few thoughts on that kind of evolving world that might inform the conversation as we're going on. First, the world looks really different today than it did in 2010. So 2010, if I think about when I was working as a diplomat, that the UK had just started its golden era with China. I'm not sure any of our politicians would necessarily use that language today. President Obama had just had his very famous speech in Cairo, which the 2010 report talked about resetting the US's relationships with the Islamic world. And actually, if we talk about resets, when I was in Moscow, we had a visit by then Secretary of State Clinton, who pushed a literal bright red reset button with Foreign Minister Lavrov in Moscow about US-Russian relations. And again, not sure we're in the same space there. And frameworks also need to be adapted to include areas that they hadn't previously considered. So if you look at the 2010 report, it's pretty much silent on the role of kind of industry and particularly big tech. And for better or worse, it's hard to argue against the fact that people like Elon Musk are now genuine foreign policy actors. If we think about the power that he holds as an individual and his company to influence the warfighting effort of Ukraine around their ability to communicate through Starlink, that is a huge ability to use science and technology to affect foreign policy. And there are other areas that don't get much of a look in as well. Research security, that we've talked a lot about in sessions here and features a lot in international debates. It basically appears twice in the report. The first mention is down on page 27. And in both spaces, it's framed very much as research security as a barrier to collaboration, rather than the much more nuanced conversation that I think a lot of us will be having today in those science advice spaces about how we balance those things. And then the third reflection I'd have on that report, and this might be a controversial point, so I look forward to kind of questions and challenges on it. But there's a great sentence in it that notes scientific values of rationality, transparency, and universality are the same the world over. And I'm not sure that's true. I think it's arguable whether it was true in 2010, but I'm not sure we see that in how we're cooperating as scientific partners, how we're working internationally. So there's a lot to kind of look at. So I'll come back to my slightly flippant question at the start, as my watch reminds me that my 5 minutes is up. My answer to kind of, am I a science diplomat? My personal answer is to say no, I'm not. Because I don't think anyone is a science diplomat. I'm not sure it's something that you are. I think science diplomacy is a thing that we engage in. Science diplomacy is an important aspect of international work across countries, but that doesn't mean that all international work across countries is science diplomacy. And so that's the final point I want to make in this introduction is, should those frameworks be inclusive or exclusive? Should we put borders up which help us define a concept, that help us kind of study and focus it, or is that unhelpful gatekeeping to a subject and kind of unnecessarily exclusive? To put it really simply, if someone goes to an international conference and comes home and says, I'm a science diplomat, is that a problem? I'll leave that there.
Thank you very much, Ian. And thanks to your watch as well for helping in moderating the session. No, I think you have a lot of fascinating points that you have raised, and the question of, especially in an emerging field, you know, what stability means and how much can we really be responsive especially in a fast-changing, and what does it mean to the field? These are some of the questions that you could ask. Now I'm going to move to, last but not least, to Christian Allen. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage. You know Christian Allen, she has worked in the intersection of science and public policy in multiple contexts, including in subnational, national, and multilateral systems. She served as a Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor in New Zealand, and Christian currently is the Executive Secretary of INGSA since its founding, in fact. So Christian has been a co-partner in all this framing of the questions and the session, the diversity, and trying to also draw a line in between. So Christian, can you share with us your own thoughts, but also listening to some of the interventions, how we can sort of wrap it up to open it for more conversation?
Well, and this is where we maybe didn't communicate as well as we might have, because I want to also take this opportunity to share some of my own work, which is in the Viewpoints document. So there is a piece there. I want to draw that line across, yes, but I'll just take part of my time to talk a little bit about, first I'll draw the line across. The line across here is that these are all opportunities to share what's new, what's innovative, what's being updated and rethought, whether they're tools, whether they're frameworks, whether they're ways of training, and growing capabilities in different areas. So we wanted to give ourselves, as organizers of the conference, an opportunity to air, I suppose, and discuss and get feedback on some of these new and innovative thoughts. That's the first thing. The second thing is I realized that I am slightly mislabeled in part on this, because yes, I am the Executive Secretary of INGSA, but I'm also here wearing a different hat in my capacity as a researcher. So I am, I suppose as many of us are in the room, a practitioner academic, and sometimes I get to practice my day job, which isn't the Executive Secretary of INGSA, which is as a researcher at the University of Auckland. So just indulge me one moment to address the Viewpoints essay that I wrote, which brings a different angle, I think, to some of the what's new in science advice. And in the spirit of where we started this conference, I'll just tell you a quick story. And that story is, as the Chief of Staff for, at the time, Sir Peter Gluckman in New Zealand, the Chief Science Advisor of New Zealand, one of the things that frustrated our office most was that we were unable to deal with those long-term, complex, intractable problems, because we were dealing with the sort of day-to-day writing policy documents, trying to synthesize material, get it out there, be timely, be relevant, be efficient. And so a lot of stuff, and in fact the types of problems that we've been talking about at this conference, the really complex stuff, just kept getting pushed, and which is what happens everywhere by the nature of the political cycle. And so when the office of the Chief Science Advisor transitioned to the next Chief Science Advisor in New Zealand, because we were based at the university, a lot of us at the time returned to or some of us took the opportunity to return to research, which we'd missed. And through that work, we, a team of us, had the thought that, well, this is our opportunity to actually figure out in what ways can we address these problems that is beyond the current frameworks that we know, beyond the current ways we think about these things. And so we, in the spirit of building capabilities, wrote a research grant to see if we could learn by doing. And that's where we developed a couple of questions around having long-term, complex conversations with citizens. And what does that look like? And I know that if you've been in you've all been in other sessions, in these last couple of days, it keeps coming up. Where are the communities? Where are the citizens? And in fact, over the 10 years of INGSA, that's partly been what's been added to the equation is science, policy, societies. So what we did at the University of Auckland was a research project that was launched around deliberative democratic practices. So that's sort of just as science is evolving, science advice is evolving, so too is policy making. And it's, we're seeing it become more consultative. We're seeing decision making at times, such as in deliberative work, being devolved to communities, depending on the questions. And this is a way of gathering a group of representative citizens in a highly structured way and taking them through a process to, very importantly, learn together about a problem, bring the evidence directly to the citizens so that it is not mediated through governments, it is not mediated through lobbyists, it is not mediated through anybody, it's given directly to the citizens in a facilitated way, and they're given an opportunity to deliberate, to look at that evidence, to question experts, to frame new questions and let the facilitators know if they think they need more information about something and ask for it in the same way that a jury might call for evidence. And then deliberate with their fellow citizens, and especially those with whom they might not otherwise come into contact. And so for us as team members in the office of the former Chief Science Advisor and now reverting back to academe, this was revelatory. This was really, truly a new way of thinking about science advice that kind of skipped over the policymakers or allowed citizens themselves to be, I wouldn't say policymakers, and at times decision makers, if the remit was there from government to have them make the decision, but certainly giving much more thoughtful consultative feedback to government. And so I wanted to share that story as well, because I think that it fits a panel where we're really trying to talk about what's new and what's innovative, and how we as actors in this science advisory space, having delivered advice at the central government level, we're now working at a very different level and learning as we did just how different those dynamics were when we could deliver advice directly to members of the public who had been called together in a formal way to learn about a problem and then to provide their own consensus and informed recommendations to government. So I'll leave it there. I've left you with an example, and I'm not sure I've drawn a thread through the panel, but let's have a discussion.
No, you did. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christian. I think you did it so nicely. In fact, you told us about a new term that science advice is taking, a very innovative one at that, but also making the connection. So and the timer is only after you start speaking further about your research. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope we have about 35 minutes, 40 minutes for discussion. Let me just kickstart the conversation with one question for Shaheen and Alma. You both are involved in mentorship, as part of the training element that you're doing in the continent when it comes to Shaheen, and in Mexico, in Latin America, Alma. So for science advice, it seems mentorship has something, what does it mean? Or where does it fit in terms of skill development, in terms of, an emerging field? What is the place of mentorship in science advice, currently and in the future? Could you briefly comment on this?
Thank you, Binyam. And I think that your question is very pertinent because we have seen from the mentees that there is a thirst for science advice because they are doing all these research, they are publishing their research, their findings, but it is only circulating in some restricted circles and it's not getting out there to be used at the level of government. But what we have also seen is that their research may be used at the levels of citizens. And one of the things that we have seen from the project that are there is that I think because Christian talked about this bringing evidence to citizens. So when we are bringing evidence to citizens, we also have to communicate the science to citizens. One of the projects that have come out from this mentoring program is the language that scientists use, the jargon that scientists use. So how do we translate that into a language that our citizens would understand? Because it is important that when we are talking to them, they also understand what we are meaning. On one hand, we have decision makers not understanding the scientific language, and on the other hand, we have citizens also not understanding the same language that the scientist is using. So how do we also train our mentees and scientists in general in Africa and, of course, beyond, to communicate effectively their research finding? And I think that would be one of the focus going forward. And this is a very important part of science advice skills development program that when we are moving ahead, this is something that we think we need to focus more on going forward.
On the place of mentorship, impact, also volunteerism in science advice.
Yes, thank you, Binyam. Yeah, absolutely. The mentorship is it's especially important on science advice. And what is the place of science advice in mentorship? Well, I think that in the whole things that are related, but let me just share with you one story regarding this with the mentorship thing. We started, well, I work in, I am sure that most of you work in very traditional research centers. I work in a very traditional research center in Mexico. Specifically, the center was founded for mathematical science, exact science, the very, very traditional science. So when we went to gauge the students' interest in careers beyond the academia, we found a lot of interest, but there was not mentees for these persons, for these students who want to know more about science policy interface, science advice, science diplomacy, even entrepreneurships and so on. So after this, we said, okay, now we are not policy makers or decision makers. We need to achieve a training program in the real life, in a daily day with policymakers, a kind of training program for young scientists, like in the US, the Science and Policy Fellowships. And we developed and proposed, and we were able to launch a training program, the very first in Latin America, within the Mexico City government. And we had 6 fellows, early career researchers, working day by day, hand by hand, with the Minister of Science, of Education, of Health, and so on. And yeah, it was a very successful program, and all the ministers said, okay, it's very good for me to have this kind of scientists who are not normal scientists, you know, because they can speak both languages. So yeah, even with this kind of success, we are dealing yet with the fact that the decision makers say, okay, if this advisory work can be done, then it should be done only for senior scientists, with a lot of prizes, with a lot of things, you know. So they canceled the program, and the mentorship program was, yeah, it ended then. But after that, we developed a syllabus, a course, an elective course. And what is the science advice on the course? Where the whole curriculum is for science advice. What is science advice? What are the kind of work that you can be that you can do in the science policy interface as scientists? How you can speak with a policymaker or with a decision maker, or write a policy memo or a policy brief or an evidence note. What is evidence? Because I heard the question before. Sorry, I just want to comment this. For us, we learned that evidence is just information in context that is useful for decision-making process. That's it. So with that in mind, we designed that course, and every year we are updated the course, and obviously the INGSA Latin America and the INGSA partners and colleagues are helping a lot with this mentoring, because I think that really is a mentoring program. But yeah, it's only it's a baby step, but it is important, I think.
Thank you very much, Alma. It is, I think, beyond a baby step, but I think that's how everything will start, so it will be very relevant. Natalie, can I come to you with the earlier point about finding a common language? And you know, it's the connection between science. Science, I know it recently, for all the reasons, it's becoming divisive, you know, the silos, all of that, but still there is that potential to be a common language, a lingua franca, you know, for being human, and for all the things that it has done to humanity. So in setting these frameworks, in struggling frameworks and quality assurance, so how much can we draw into science advice, the common languages, the common framework? Can you reflect a little bit on that?
I think 2 things. So the first one is we find a common language through learning this language, and learning this language through skill building, as you said. So this is up to the researchers to kind of learn how to communicate with audiences, not necessarily non-academic, but also among colleagues from different disciplines, from different even sometimes research teams, different countries, because that's not so as easygoing as one could imagine. And the second part to this, I think, which is important, is to find this common terminology for the science policy interface, really to understand what is out there, what kind of, I mean, I'm speaking a lot about documents because I was involved in building this repository in Germany, and it's based on text, but this is of course not the only output, but it's a start. It's a start to think of what types and how do we show what kind of evidence, kind of underlying, how do we define evidence, what kind of underlying evidence kind of feeds into the document. Because I think this is also not, if you have a very broad diversity, you don't necessarily kind of dive into all the details. And I think this would be a framework that would serve for some orientation. And this said, I just wanted to emphasize that this is not a one solution for all, because I heard it a lot yesterday, and I think a few times today, that of course there's no one fit solution. This is very, all countries have different contexts, topics have different contexts, so this can serve as a guide, but I think as a quite helpful a guideline in designing these interfaces by using a similar, at least, terminology. And of course it has to be flexible, because research is very dynamic, it changes, and these outputs and these formats also change. Yeah, so I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did reflect on it, so thank you very much. And the point about not being one, one sort of fit-it-all solution, rather with all the diversity. It's a common language, but still with all the diversity. That's why, in fact, I wanted to use the lingua franca rather than even. It's not about a single language. Thank you very much. And finally, Christian and Ian, I know you are both, emphasize the changes, trying to catch the changing wind, but at the same time setting, a standard and a framework. So it seems inherently these two things are pulling the field into different directions. So it can be a challenge, but there is also an opportunity to be creative. And I see the citizenship, the third wave, what you have called the third wave, is probably one of the things. So can you comment on how those two, how to balance those and use it as a force to make to reflect the complexity of the field and being true to the changes? Yes, so you both can comment on it,
Take
and
a stab at it first.
Feel free if you want to say something.
I really appreciate you've pointed out this tension, because it's certainly what we felt, but it's a creative tension, and there is an opportunity to really do something interesting with it. And I believe that, yes, while it is a lingua franca, while there is a common language, while we understand standards, even very nuanced standards, it's necessary but not sufficient. It's not the only language. And I think that that's what was important in what we were learning about looking at these long-term complex problems. Why are they long-term and complex? Because they're not easy to solve. Why are they not easy to solve? Because they're political also. They're not just scientific. And once it's understood that that's what we're dealing with, whether it's in New Zealand, for instance, questions around land use and adaptation to climate change and changing the way we use the landscape for both being productive, but also understanding what that does to biodiversity, and understanding how we can no longer actually use the land in the ways that we once did because of flooding, because of the way the landscape has been so engineered until now. So, these are questions that will require huge transformative change, and when you're dealing with huge transformative change, you're dealing necessarily with people and how you bring them along in that change. And so that's why some questions lend themselves better to opening up much more broadly, especially when they're questions that are politically complex, and where our experiment, for instance, in deliberative democracy, allowed for the decision makers to almost devolve that question and say, yeah, this is too hard for us, and we're worried about votes, so let's just see what the public thinks. instead. And that was a challenge for us as, practitioners in science advice to say, well, just as been brought up here, like how do we frame or how do we convey the information for the public who are involved in these processes? And what we quickly learned, and I think what was the surprising takeaway for us, was just to stop and listen to them and to allow them to frame the questions, because that was what the key piece was, is how do we know we're asking the right questions? Well, the people in the assemblies would tell us what they wanted to know. And this has come up a few times in different discussions over the last few days, is, we may be able to, as science advisors, give the advice, but we also need to think about what questions we're answering, and are those the right questions? And I think that was the biggest revelation, I suppose, for us in these processes that we were trialing in New Zealand, was that to stop and listen to the publics that we were working with, and to really know what they wanted answered, and to let them frame those questions, and then bring in the expertise after that. I don't know if that answered. Speaking of answering questions, I don't know if that answered it.
It's being reflective, so yes, you have touched on the points. Ian?
I won't have much more to that. I guess I think you're right, there is a tension. My argument would be that if you don't revisit frameworks over time that you're using, and if those are frameworks that you're actively using, if you don't revisit the definitions for them, they can quite rapidly get out of date and become so broad to be completely useless, or so outdated to not represent what we're doing. And in an entirely different field to not science diplomacy, but if we think about the science communication debate, we're actually on the debate science communication as a kind of as an activity, as an area of study. 2 decades ago, we'd be talking about kind of public understanding of science, and we'd have quite a kind of paternalistic approach to kind of how we went out, and we're going to kind of educate people about kind of science with a capital S, whereas now it's about engaging people in that conversation. It's about how science affects their lives. It involves them there. That's an evolution of the field that makes it more effective today. So I think there is a tension, but if you don't revisit them, you just end up with something that is meaningless and doesn't help the kind of conversation move on.
Thank you very much. So now it's time for you to ask questions and to contribute to the discussions. I will accept 3 hands, and then we take it round by round. So I see 1, 2. Is there a 3rd hand? Okay, 3, and I will have the 2nd round. Too many mics on the other side, so you can share.
Thank you very much. My name is Gavin Costigan from the Foundation for Science and Technology in the UK. Really interesting discussion. Thank you so much to the panel. I was just reflecting, actually been reflecting over the last couple of days. You can always divide things into groups, and it isn't entirely true, but if I say there are sort of 3 sets of professionals in this, there are the academics who have evidence and expertise, who really need to understand and develop skills and everything else to be able to communicate science advice. There are the policymakers who really need to understand the science system, the academic system, and to be able to help frame those questions. But there's this emerging career of people in the middle, and they come by different names. I'll call them evidence brokers, but they come by different names. And people come into that either through a university route or through a civil service route or some other way. And some of those people are located in universities, some of them are located within government, some of them, I guess, are located in independent organisations. 5-6 years ago, that was very nascent, and there was a whole lot of people running around making stuff up, full of enthusiasm, a little bit of money, let's do some stuff. It's getting to the point now where they've learnt some lessons, and they're beginning to coalesce together. They're beginning to understand what it means. But it's still not long enough that there's a career path. It's not long enough to know what people do, how people move in and out of that. But it seems to me it's ripe for some frameworks and tools, which is exactly what we're talking about, so that those groups who are in it don't reinvent the wheel, and those people who are coming into it have somewhere to start. And I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that.
Thank you very much. I got intrigued by some of the preliminary comments made by the panelists. And I think my interest would be on the issue of quality assurance for good evidence that can inform science advice. I thought that is something that we should look into much more deeply than we have done here. And perhaps, I think she's the one who brought it forth. I wish she could shed more light onto what she thinks should be done to advance this to the next level. And then there is the issue of one being a diplomat and yet not being a science diplomat. Where is the dividing line? Should we begin to train the diplomats that there are to begin to appreciate science diplomacy in their roles? Might this be a way to go?
Thank you. Just building up from the question, I would like to ask, how can we ensure that science advice is not upended by conflicts of interest? We have seen that during COVID, we have seen that with plastic, we have seen that again with marine pollution. So how can we make sure that science advice, with the frameworks and tools that we have developed so far, do they address those concerns?
I'll go first because then that means I don't need to answer all of them. I can just have a stab at the ones I quite like. So on the question about kind of training diplomats to appreciate science, it's a really good question, and I think different foreign services around the world do that to a lesser or greater extent. The UK Foreign Service, I think, is pretty good in this space. There's something called the Science Innovation Network, which is a cadre of diplomats and country-based staff who specialise in science and provide that kind of expertise. And there's also a good level of kind of training across the diplomatic service about kind of science and how you engage it and how you can support it. Actually, I'd turn that round. I think what we don't do enough of is training scientists how to be diplomats, or rather, training scientists to understand diplomacy. And I think there's a really important bit of work in this space, and it comes around conversations about national security, about research security, and ensuring that's a nuanced conversation of making sure that we can have a set of really kind of developed and grown-up conversations about how we do international collaboration at a time that has never been more important, but has also been never more difficult than in certain spaces, and how we do that. And there's sometimes a bit of naivety across the scientific community about what that cooperation can look like, and that any barrier to cooperation is an affront to academic freedom. I disagree quite strongly with that kind of thesis. So I think that there's a kind of training in both ways. I think there's the diplomats about science, but also science about diplomacy. Others will want to chip in on the other points.
Maybe I can address two of them. I'll be selective the same way you have, Ian. Gavin, your point about sort of that new role that's developed, I think that, I mean, making space for that in universities has everything to do with changing how academics are, what their KPIs are, what are their performance indicators, and how do they advance in their careers. We're seeing some progress there, I think, in the way that academic CVs are being adjudicated. But you know, there have been sessions in this conference that deal exactly with that, and I know that the cohort of emerging scholars coming up is really agitating for that, and rightly so, because it's recognized that that's the emerging need. I'd also note that, you know, there is a bit of enlightened view in universities that I've noticed where, you know, a generation ago, the big new thing was to have the TTOs, the tech transfer offices, you know, well. Exactly. So you grow up through that generationally, and now what are they as well? They're impact offices, you know, policy impact offices. So there is some place where that professionalization is starting to happen to be that conduit. It's not complete, I don't think, that journey by any means, but we're getting closer. The conflict of interest question is really interesting, and I'll take it the way I understood it. And also drawing on my example from deliberative democratic work, one of the things that conflict of interest was at the forefront of that work, actually, and what was really interesting about it in some of the processes that we did was that because the science was going directly to members of the public, it was under public scrutiny, so there was no place to hide. There was no way for the researchers or the academics or the experts coming in to do anything but present evidence that answered the question that the members of the assembly wanted answered. So it was not a backroom discussion with, you know, policymakers or decision makers. It didn't go into any kind of process that the public didn't have a direct access to. And I think that actually, I mean, it's the most contentious issues that are probably the most susceptible to, I wouldn't say susceptible to conflicts of interest, but accusations of conflict of interest. And to get over that hurdle, to do it in a process that was so open, really allowed for that public scrutiny. And so that's one method of doing that. It's, you know, that's just one tool, is a deliberative process where members of the public can have direct access to the information. So conflict of interest is not, you know, becomes less of an issue, or the potential conflict of interest becomes less of an issue. But as tools like that grow, you know, hopefully protection against conflict or even perceived conflict will grow with them.
Yes, thanks a lot for your question. So I will also address two. Thank you on the question on quality. I like that there's some interest in it, because it's a very difficult one, and it's a very difficult one if you take that every discipline needs an own approach, and interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, something else. So I think what's key in this sense is that we shouldn't think of you know, only researchers who deliver expertise, and this expertise has to be checked on quality. Those are all actors that kind of are part of the equation, also intermediaries. So they also have their own quality expectations. Speaking of researchers, the most feasible part that can help and can serve for quality is transparency. And transparency in a sense that communicating uncertainties openly, communicating, we do use the word reliability, but it's not the best, because it discriminates a bit expertise from ongoing studies, but I would say stage of inquiry. So sometimes you have a field, like, for example, climate change, which has a high consensus in the academic world that climate change is a problem, and that has not been the case in the 70s, because then the debate only began. So this, like, marking the stage of inquiry, like, is it a topic that you have consensus, that you can say something on the meta level, or is it the pandemic in the beginning, where everyone was lost and didn't know, like, what to say, and those were informed opinions, preliminary results, which also should and can go public, but like with the information transparently speaking about uncertainties, and that this is something preliminary. And then multiplicity of perspectives, so countering instrumentalization and countering selective knowledge integration in policy decisions. And I think that here a lot can be helped by deliberation. So if it's openly visible, like that there are other views and conflicting results, then this can also serve for more quality. And like on the other side, of course, questions of language, understandability, and applicability. So focus on real problems, so not the agenda setting. I'm not talking about questions, that this is something very relevant, and it's also kind of shows the quality on the interface, and it's an important part. I can go on talking about it. So we are working on a list of criteria, or very flexible criteria, but this would be, I think, the main. And then speaking of intermediaries, I like that topic very much, because I think that intermediaries should be valued, and should be valued just as other stakeholders on the science policy interface, just like policymakers and researchers and whoever is engaged in the work. And it's a professional profile that is being formed, and that should be formed further. And I think we shouldn't say of really research or academic science delivering the knowledge, because actually policymakers, public officials, they are often also experts in their field. And sometimes they can open up new insights, and new insights that were maybe not that present in the researcher's mind. And here comes that also civil society actors, or just societal actors, can also deliver and act as agenda setters. So this, I think, is also important to consider, and to consider that intermediaries, they are as well experts in the field, and they have what connects researchers and all other ones.
Thank you. Just this kind of these are the things that professionalization and institutionalization requires. Positions for these intermediate professionals who are doing this job. They don't need to be full-time scientists or policy makers or policy decisions, but they can have in a place in the middle, just in the middle, and speak the both language. But also they need that this job being recognized, and obviously not in the academia, because the assessment in academia it's only, well, in Latin America and in most of the global south countries, it's still based only in quantitative points. But I think that this is the next step, a very needed step that we need to address. And for that, we need advocacy. Science advice is not advocacy. Advice is not advocacy. But in order to get some places for these intermediates, we need advocacy, I think. And on the other hand, regarding the conflict of interest, I think that some weeks ago somebody asked, or we were in a meeting, and this person asked, "Hey, what become a scientist who goes in policy?" And we said, "I don't know." And he said, "In a politician, because a scientist without training in science advice is only a politician." And we can see this in our country. For example, in my country, you can see this. A scientist that is now in the cabinet, and he doesn't care more about science and evidence or nothing. He is only following the instructions of the president, or following the direction. So I really believe that if we don't know how to play the game, the conflict of interest will be always there. So mentorship and training programs, I think that it maybe is not the answer, but it can help.
Yes, I just want to follow up on what Alma has said. In my previous job, we used to provide advice to the government, and with my background in science and now working in policy, so what we have a structure in place whenever we are required to provide advice is that we set a panel of experts coming from academia, from industry, from different places in the society, where we would work together, and that would minimize conflict of interest. And also any report that we would prepare, we would draft, that would also become a public report, so that at the end of the day, it would be transparent, the decisions that we are taking. But I think that in times of emergency and urgency, this is where there is a huge risk of conflict of interest, and even, corruption, and goes beyond and above all that. So this is where we need to find systems in place to prevent these types of conflict of interest.
Thank you very much, Shaheen. So one last round of questions. I have already anyone else who wants to comment? Okay, 2 and 3. So that's the last round. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Imelda Chukwu. I am actually participating from INGSA Africa. So I just wanted to make, I don't know if it's a comment or a question. So I was recently involved in a research group in Germany. It was a multidisciplinary research group that looked at the challenges at the science policy interface. We were supposed to look at how philosophy can facilitate interactions at the interface, science policy interface, and then using pandemic response and biosecurity as case study. Then we quickly started asking questions like, what really counts as evidence? And how do you even know when you have enough evidence? And questions like that. And then we quickly realized that scientific evidence is not the only evidence used by decision makers. There is religious value, ethical value, cultural, even indigenous knowledge. So, I mean, we had a very interesting time and quite a couple of outputs. But that was what ignited my interest in joining the Science Advice Skill Development Program by INGSA Africa. And I can really tell you that that was really impactful and really critical for developing the future science advice advocates, or maybe professionals, like you may call it, because I joined the group as a core scientist, so I didn't know what my role at the science advice or science policy interface was. So maybe the publish and perish rule means that I'm incentivized to publish my findings, but I don't understand what my incentive would be to participate in science advice. So at this point, I would just want to know, how do we get scientists or researchers, if you may say, how do you get them interested in science advice? And I guess we have to just keep asking that question, like someone said yesterday, ask all the whys, and then not be in a hurry to jump into the conclusions. So at some point, but this forum, I'm really grateful for this opportunity, because this is a forum where I'm seeing decision makers, I'm seeing the scientists, there's the knowledge producers and the knowledge users and even the knowledge brokers. Everybody's here talking at the same time and having this very wonderful discussion. And I'm really just going to say that I'm happy to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. We're also happy that you are here. Yes.
Thank you, panel member, and you have shared a very important message to me and to audience. So I want to share my experience. I find, advances in capacity development for science advice, frameworks and tools. Maybe we should add serious framework and tools, because we always emphasize evidence. Evidence, of course, very important, but following what kind of logical, serious. So that is, so you mentioned, for example, nowadays academic publication, their quantitative and emphasize. But that is not all. So we want to try to integrate different researchers from university and try to get them engaged in the policy making process. Then, try to, keep the tension, the qualitative and quantitative research methodology integrated in the, the capacity building. So this is also, I think this is in different countries have different government administration systems. For example, science advisor system in the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Some are, have no such kind of systems. They have a department within the government, Ministry of Science Technology, and the other ministry have a department for in charge science and technology issues. And also there are a lot of research institutions like in UK within the university, Sproul, Manchester, and so on. So try how to bring all these engaged. That is for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question and comment. Last question from our friend and colleague.
Thank you for the insight. My name is Norbert Chouafé from Cameroon. I would like to add something, data in the framework, because the main challenge of science nowadays is availability of data. So maybe it will be data, a science policy data interface. Because with this framework, it's easy to, you are solving the problem of a student. Because the main challenge of students nowadays is availability of the data. You have taken the case of COVID-19. Data were not available around the world. So the key challenge to address in science, I think, is availability of data. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna run around. I will start from Shaheen, and you can respond to one or two of the questions. Each one of us will have 2 minutes, and we use it also just to make your final point or wrap up, whatever you want to say.
Thank you very much. I think that I will talk just about the data. I think that data is available, in my humble opinion, but it is not accessible. So this is something that we have to work on. There is open science. We have a lot of reports also, for example, in INGSA on a website. But I think that we should try as interfaces between scientists and science advice, we try to make these evidence and data more available and accessible to the public, and this is what we need to work on in the future. So this is my first point. Regarding science advice skills development program, so some of the mentees have said, so what now? How do I give science advice to my government? What are the channels to give advice to my government? So this is really a complex landscape for us at INGSA Africa even to navigate, because each countries have a different ecosystem for science advice. So if you are at a university, is there a structure in place for you, for your findings, for your output to become public and to reach out to the government? So we need to be working on that also. We need to be working with the government and also to train, I would say, to build capacity at governmental level for them to understand the importance of science advice and for them to build, for example, a database of scientists who can participate in these kind of science advice communities. And the aim for the science advice skills development program, I would say, is eventually to build a community of practice in Africa and beyond, where we will be having all these people that will be able to speak to the government in the language that they will understand and that they will be able to make an impact. And I would say that we have one of the outcome of the program, which is which came from a mentor-mentee peer, which is the Global Indigenous Youth Summit on Climate Change. So this happened last year. Professor Paul Berkman from the USA and one of the mentee, Temitope Sokbanmu from Nigeria. So they have established this youth summit, and we had like more than 1,000 people registering on this program, this event, and now they have a website that is on Future Earth. So I would encourage you to look into that. One last point, the call for the Science Advice Skills Development Program is out for the third cohort, and we really need mentors, because without mentors we cannot have mentees, we cannot do this mentoring, and it is a volunteering program, and we need people who are committed, who are passionate about science advice to help us. And mentors need not be from the African continent, but mentees are the one that we're training in Africa. So I really launched this call here and encourage you to look at it and to apply. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Binjam. Yeah, regarding the data, I think that there is a lot of information and a lot of data, but it's not useful for the policy processes, because it's in different kind of formats that they can use. So they need an intermediate or another kind of resources. And I think that is just pointed what the lady said. I think that is exactly for that reason, because there is a lot of a different kind of evidence. It's not scientific evidence. It's not only scientific information coming to the process, that we are not saying anymore science-based decision-making. So we say science-informed decision-making, because it's different, and it can be a deal breaker with the policymakers, because they say this is not only a science issue. So very quickly, sometimes I discuss with students and colleagues, and when I ask, who among you knows who is your represent in the Congress or in the Senate? And there are only 2 hands, maybe, raised. And I think that we, as scientists, yes, we can also exercise our own political rights, but we also have a duty, an obligation like citizens, and be more active, even like citizens, is important. It matters. So I think that in all these efforts of building and institutionalize the science advice and build a profession for the next generation of science advisors, we need to work in a very collaborative form, in a very collaborative way, because this will not be an easy job. So we need to work together.
Thank you, Binyam, and thanks for the questions. I would actually like to say a few words about incentives. So, of course, it's a long political debate that researchers are basically being punished because if they engage in societal debates, they don't have enough time to write their papers and to hand in their papers. So my point and my idea would be to, like, for the future, these kind of other outputs, policy papers, reports, something where expertise also is a part of, or that are studies just for a different purpose often, with very good quality assurance mechanisms, they should be made citable and part of the track record. So that's, for example, what we also do in our repositories, so that every document is at least getting a DOI and can be exchanged. This is one thing, and the other, we've done a few years ago, I think it was 2020 or 2021, a survey among researchers. It's biased because it's in Germany, but still asking about their engagement, social engagement in science policy advice, and also about incentives. And I was surprised to learn that for a lot, not the financial remuneration was top, but acknowledgement. And acknowledgement in the sense that often researchers who engage, they don't hear back from the other side. They don't know that they feed their expertise and they don't know how it was used. And so this is maybe a side note for many of us who work at the interface, that like bringing back insights or bringing back what has happened is important, and is really important for those who have the wish and who have the motivation to engage in science policy and science society interactions.
Yeah. I've two really quick points because I'm conscious we're standing between you all and coffee. So I'm really glad you mentioned the incentives. I think you could do a whole conference on that, and I think kind of you talk about impact officers, there's a whole space about whether we're getting that right at all. The one bit I want to throw in that I'm not sure we've covered enough in this conference is how much this needs to be a two-way conversation as well. So the point, Gavin, your point about kind of knowledge brokers is critical. It's not just about all the expertise that exists out there in scientists and kind of throwing that at policymakers and hoping that they use it. It's also about the kind of the messages coming back about how it was useful, but also about that policy debate shaping where the research activities takes, and make sure that we're kind of having that two-way conversation, so this isn't happening in isolation. And I think that there's probably more we need to do to make sure that that's embedded at every stage, that we are thinking about that as a flow back and forth, not just one way from science through advice to policymakers.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try to be quick as well. I mean, I guess my takeaway thought here still kind of remains in that tension kind of space, but I think it's also still that creative tension. And I would say that as we are talking about professionalizing, institutionalizing, codifying, what I'm taking from it too is that we constantly update and we constantly recertify and we constantly upgrade our thinking, and that most importantly we pay attention to changing contexts for our science advice, because that leads to innovative thinking around how we can deliver, which was, our experience with doing more deliberative work. But as problems become more complex, as communities may lose faith in institutions, that's the very moment where we need to say, take a look at ourselves and be very reflexive about those institutions and about the part we play in them, and how we can still be nimble in delivering advice in new ways and updating our thinking.
Thank you very much. I think what this session has become clear is the demand for INGSA, for a network like INGSA, how much it's needed, to bring people together and to co-create and to think and to project what the future looks like, but also to be responsive to the dynamic and very changing global and very complex environment. So I won't wrap up. I just want to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists once again. So that's it. Thank you very much. We have a break, a 15 minutes break, I guess, and then at 4 o'clock there is the closing plenary session that you are all invited to join. Thank you once again. We'll see you soon.